Imagine hanging from the side of a church, 60 feet above a town square, with your parachute tangled hopelessly around the steeple, and below you, in the firelight, soldiers are killing each other. You cannot climb up. You cannot cut yourself free without falling into the middle of the battle. You cannot even cry out, because the moment anyone notices you are alive, you are dead. So you do the only thing left. You let your head fall. You let your body go slack. And you hang there, swinging gently against the stone, pretending to be a corpse, while the longest 2 hours of your life crawl past beneath your boots. This is not a scene from a film. This actually happened in the first dark hours of June 6, 1944, to an American paratrooper named John Steele, and it happened above a small French town that was, at that very moment, becoming the first place in France to be set free. To understand how a man ended up dangling from a church steeple, you have to go back to the plan, and to a part of D-Day that gets far less attention than the beaches. Before a single landing craft touched the sand, the invasion began in the air, in the middle of the night. The Allies knew that if they simply landed on the beaches at dawn, the Germans could rush reinforcements forward, seal off the landing zones, and push the invasion back into the sea. So the plan called for something audacious. Drop tens of thousands of paratroopers and glider troops behind the beaches hours before the seaborne landings to seize the bridges, the crossroads, and the causeways the Germans would need, and to throw the German rear into total confusion. In the darkness before dawn, roughly 13,000 American paratroopers from 2 airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, boarded hundreds of transport planes in England and flew out over the Channel toward Normandy. John Steele was one of them. He was a private in the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division, a unit that called itself the All-American. And Steele was no rookie. He had already jumped into combat in Sicily and in Italy. He knew what it was to leap out of a plane into a hostile night. But nothing in those earlier jumps had prepared him for what was waiting below the plains over Normandy. His drop zone was near a town called Sainte-Mère-Église. On the map, it was nothing special, a small Norman town of a few thousand people sitting at a crossroads of country roads. But that crossroads was exactly why it mattered. The roads that met at Sainte-Mère-Église connected the German positions and ran behind the beach the Allies had codenamed Utah. Whoever controlled that town controlled the movement of German troops in the area. Capturing it would cut a vital artery and protect the flank of the seaborne landings. So the All-American paratroopers were ordered to take it. But on the night of the drop, Sainte-Mère-Église was not a sleeping town. It was a town on fire. Earlier that night, a stray incendiary bomb from an Allied air raid had set a building near the town square ablaze. The fire was spreading, and the townspeople had been roused from their beds to fight it. They formed a bucket chain, hauling water from the square's pump to the burning building, and they rang the church bells to call for help and to summon more hands. All of this was being supervised by the German soldiers garrisoned in the town. So in the dead of night, the square was lit up bright as day by the flames, crowded with civilians and German troops, with the church bell clanging and everyone's eyes drawn upward by the noise and the light. And it was directly over this glowing, crowded, wide-awake square that the parachutes began to appear. Around 1:30 in the morning, the sky above Sainte-Mère-Église filled with descending paratroopers. The drop had scattered, as airborne drops so often did, and a number of men from Steele's regiment came down right on top of the town, right into the firelit square where the Germans were already gathered and already armed. It was the worst possible place to land. The flames lit the canopies from below, turning the descending Americans into clear, slow-moving targets against the night sky. For the German soldiers in the square, it was like a shooting gallery. Men were hit in the air before they ever touched the ground. Others landed among the buildings and the burning glow and were cut down as they struggled out of their harnesses. It was chaos and slaughter, and into the middle of it floated Private John Steele. His parachute carried him toward the heart of the town, and then, instead of the ground, he hit the church. His canopy caught on the steeple, on the bell tower of the church that stood over the square, and there it held. Steele's fall stopped with a jerk, leaving him dangling from the side of the spire, high above the firelit square, his parachute hopelessly fouled on the stone. He was, in that instant, utterly trapped. He could not free himself without dropping straight down into the killing ground below. He could not climb, and he was hanging in plain view, lit by the fire, above a square full of enemy soldiers who were shooting at every parachute they saw. He had also been wounded. By every rule of that night, John Steele should have died on the side of that church within seconds. So he made the only choice available to a man in his position. He played dead. He let his body go limp. He let his head loll forward against his chest. He hung from the steeple as still as he could make himself, a man impersonating his own corpse, and he prayed that the Germans below would glance up, see a dead paratrooper tangled in the spire, and look away. And he held that pose, limp, silent, in agony from his wound, deafened by the church bell ringing almost beside him, for close to 2 hours. 2 hours of hanging in his harness, 60 feet up, while the battle for the square churned beneath him, and he could do nothing but dangle and breathe as shallowly as possible, and wait. It worked for a while. Other paratroopers who had landed nearby reportedly saw him hanging there and assumed he was already dead and left him. The Germans, too, seemed to have taken him for a corpse. But eventually the deception ran out. When German soldiers finally did take an interest in the body hanging from their church, possibly to retrieve whatever papers or equipment the dead American might be carrying, they discovered that he was not dead at all. They cut him down and took him prisoner. For Steele, capture might have looked like the end of the story. It was not. In the confusion and the fighting that followed, as American forces pressed into the town, Steele managed to escape from his captors and slip back to his own side. He rejoined his unit and went on to fight in the battle for the town he had so spectacularly failed to land in cleanly. And that battle was won, despite the disaster in the square, despite the scattered drop and the terrible losses. The American paratroopers fought their way through Sainte-Mère-Église and drove the German garrison out. By around 4:30 that same morning, still hours before the main landings hit the beaches at full force, the town was in American hands. The stars and stripes went up over Sainte-Mère-Église, and it earned a permanent place in history. It became the first town in France to be liberated on D-Day, a small Norman crossroads town set free in the dark before the sun even rose on the invasion. John Steele survived his wounds, survived his captivity, and survived the war that followed. And he carried the marks of that night for the rest of his life. For his actions during the invasion, he was awarded the Bronze Star for valor and the Purple Heart for his wounds. But the strange, almost unbelievable image of him hanging from the church steeple is what made him famous. Years later, his ordeal was dramatized in a sweeping film about D-Day, and the scene of the paratrooper trapped on the spire was watched by millions. The town itself embraced the story. To this day, a life-sized model of a paratrooper, parachute and all, hangs from the steeple of the church in Sainte-Mère-Église, a permanent memorial dangling from the same spire so that no visitor will ever forget what happened there in the firelit dark of that morning. It is easy to treat John Steele's story as a freak accident, a man who got unlucky, snagged on a church, and happened to live. But there is something deeper in it, and it is worth naming. The paratroopers who jumped over Normandy that night took on one of the most frightening missions imaginable. They leapt into total darkness, behind enemy lines, with no certainty about where they would land or who would be waiting. Many of them came down scattered, alone, far from their units, in flooded fields and burning towns. The drop on Sainte-Mère-Église went horribly wrong, and men paid for it with their lives in that firelit square. And yet, out of that chaos, the mission was still accomplished. The crossroads were taken. The town was freed. The German rear was thrown into the confusion the plan had counted on. The airborne assault, for all its scattered horror, did exactly what it was meant to do. It tangled up the German response long enough for the beaches to hold. John Steele's 2 hours on the steeple are a kind of perfect, terrible symbol of that whole night. A man dropped into the dark, landing in the worst possible place, stripped of every option, surviving only by going still and refusing to give himself away. He did not win that night by fighting. He won it by enduring, by hanging on, literally, until the moment passed and a sliver of a chance appeared. And when that chance came, he took it, escaped, and went back into the fight. So the next time you see that image, the paratrooper dangling from the church steeple above the square, remember that it is not a statue of a man who failed. It is a memorial to the thousands who fell out of the sky into the dark that night, into burning towns and flooded fields, and who, against every reasonable expectation, took the ground they had been sent to take. Sainte-Mère-Église was the first town in France set free on D-Day, and one of the men who helped free it spent the opening hours of his liberation hanging from a church, playing dead, waiting for the world below him to look the other way.